All right, friends, welcome back to the podcast and episode 2. And today, my guest on the podcast is Father Gary Wright. And Father Gary Wright has been a member of the religious order known as the Society of Jesus since 1967. He graduated from University of Detroit in 1972, completed his Master of Divinity and his Master of Sacred Theology at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California, and then was ordained in 1980. He became the pastor of Saints Peter and Paul Jesuit Church in 2014. And he has done so much in all of his years. Just to name a few, his work has included parish ministry in Detroit, Cincinnati, and San Anselmo, California. He's been a part of the director of Chicago Detroit Novitiate. Well, you can correct me later. Anyway, rector of the UDM, University of Detroit Mercy Jesuit Ministry. He has served on a variety of boards, and he has also done work all over the world, including Nepal, India, East Africa, Peru, and has cross-cultural interfaith work experience with Native American spirituality, Buddhism, Sufism as well. So that's a lot of stuff. And in this episode, we try to answer the question, who are the Jesuits? He also gives tells his story about being called into the priesthood and why he chose the Jesuits. So just an FYI, we recorded this while all of the construction workers were on lunch, and then they came back early. So you may hear a little beeping and stuff in the background at the end. It definitely gave my editing skills a challenge, but I think you will get a lot out of this episode. It will be educational and inspirational. So enjoy the episode.
Good.
I'm excited. I think this is going to be a good episode.
Great.
So I know we want to talk about who are the Jesuits, but before that, I really wanted to talk about because I think a lot of people are curious, how do priests get a call to vocational ministry? Like, what does that look like? So I thought maybe if you share your story about how did you know that you were being called to the priesthood, and then how did you know you're being called specifically to be a Jesuit?
Okay.
Right, because there's lots of
options. There sure are, and I looked into a few of them. So, well, how do you know? I don't know that you really do know. You know, it's a guess, and I'll say more about that. But there were certainly glimmers in my childhood. When I grew up, it was not uncommon for kids to play mass, dressed up like a priest, and you'd have cookies or whatever to pretend it was the communion. So I did that as a kid. But then in 8th grade, back then, sometimes people went into the seminary in high school.
Oh, wow.
And I thought about that, but a priest talked to my parents and said, don't let him do that. He needs to grow up first. So that ended that. But at the end of high school is when it really started to kick in. And that was, I think, typical teenager awakening to the wider world and really becoming aware of the acute needs of the world. And I just had this sense like I want to take my life and do something about that. To the dire poverty and, the war and the racism in the world, those were the things that were motivating me. But it was in a context of some kind of early experience of God too. I was into astronomy as a kid. I had a little telescope, and I think the awareness of the size of the universe and our smallness helped. That was kind of a religious experience for me. It was sort of like the awe at where did all this come from, and an awe of a sense of God. So this thinking about what I was going to do with my life was in that context of God. But when you say, how did you know? I would say I didn't know until after I had been in the Jesuit order for 15 years.
Wow.
And I think that's part of our spirituality, though, is we use the phrase confirmation. You know, like you make a decision, but then it's only life experience through which God can really confirm what you as a human being are guessing at,
Right.
you know. So I remember on the day of my 15th anniversary, that night I had a dream. And I thought it was as strange, well, as most dreams are strange, but it clicked like the next day. And in the dream, I was driving on a freeway, and I kept going by these exit ramps and thinking about getting off, but I never did. And and I realized that was like all the times I could have left the order, but decided. And then this moment came where, oh, I'm on the right road, and I'm here, you know.
Yeah.
So
That's awesome. And now you were raised Roman Catholic, so
yes.
how did you decide to be actually, because you can be ordained as a Roman Catholic priest, but
yes.
how do you decide if you want to be part of an order, and what made you choose the Jesuit?
Yeah, there were I think two major things that influenced that, and unusual for that time. I had never met a Jesuit. I didn't know any Jesuits,
Really?
and most of my classmates in the Jesuits had gone to a Jesuit high school.
Right.
But I didn't have that. There were two things though. One was that I had a teacher in high school who gave me books under the table that were suspect at the time by a Jesuit named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Oh, my.
And that was very influential because he was a paleontologist, and so his professional field was dealing with evolution. And he wrote from the perspective of contemporary science and an evolutionary view of biology and the universe and all, and put that together with the religious tradition and with spirituality. And that was the first time I had ever heard anybody speak from a truly modern contemporary standpoint about faith and religion. So I thought, wow, this guy is something. And he was a Jesuit.
Wow.
So little did I know, though, that he was almost squished out of existence by the Jesuit orders because he was so far ahead of his time. But at any rate, that was a big influence. I thought, well, this guy's a Jesuit. And then it was the time I was in high school during the Second Vatican Council, which was this huge, episode of change in the church. And I noticed that a lot of the articles in the press about the council were by Jesuits. And the book of the council documents that came out was edited by a Jesuit. So that got who are these Jesuits? And they seem to be at the forefront of change and progress in the church. So based on that, what I guess these are the things you say, how do you know? It's like when you look back, you say, there's no reasonable human explanation. Why would a 15 or 16-year-old be interested in these things? But I was. And I remember I sat down on my own and I wrote letters to about 4 or 5 religious orders saying, I'm interested in a vocation. What do you have to say for yourselves? And they sent me their brochures and stuff. And actually the Jesuit brochure was so bad, but I looked at it and it had been printed in like 1948 or something. So I'm like, well, this isn't very up to date. So, but I ended up, being, when I actually met some Jesuits then for interviews, I felt that vibe of people that are looking forward. So,
right. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I read your bio. I'm gonna do your bio, talk about your bio in the intro for this episode. But I mean, you have done so much.
Yeah, I'm so old.
So much. You have been all over different places. So let's just talk about who are the Jesuits. So somebody's starting to ask that question about just the heart of it, and I guess where they came from, and some people might even not know about Saint Ignatius.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, well, that's the place to begin. So, um, there's been over the history of the church different saints that rose up and gathered followers and then formed these communities of monks in the early days or priests. So Ignatius was one of those figures in the 1500s, but he really pioneered a new form of religious community because prior to that, it was monks living in monasteries. The ideal was you you pull apart from the corrupt world and live your life. And then you had St. Francis and St. Dominic came along with the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Well, they broached that frontier a little bit, like you still lived in the monastery, but you went out into the world,
Right.
and then you came back to the monastery. Whereas St. Ignatius had the idea of a religious community that would be completely dedicated to serving others. And so, he just started with a handful of followers that were attracted to him. And in his early days, he wasn't intending to start a religious order, but, that's what happened as they progressed. And then it just grew rapidly with their particular vision in the 1500s. It grew very rapidly. And it was the age when Europeans were going out into the world, the age of discovery, so-called, and they became part of that. So they were, in the 1500s already, they were in Latin America and in India. Wow. And starting schools all over the world. So we became, by the 1700s, we were the largest educational system in the world. And but also missionaries, people that were pioneering in other lands outside of Europe. So maybe something about the Jesuit spirituality, which I think really gets to the core of it.
Right.
Yeah. So there are two core pieces that St. Ignatius left us, and that I think really influenced what the Jesuits are like, and certainly have influenced my life. And one is the spiritual exercises, which is notes that he took when he spent months in solitude, in contemplation, actually living in a cave, and kind of really withdrawing. But it was the spiritual experiences he had there that he felt drawn that could be shared with others. So, and at the heart of that is a deep conviction that each human being has the potential for a personal relationship with the Creator. And, our Jesuit formation is long, so I had lived with that idea for years. And I still remember when I was about 30 was the first time I was asked to give a talk in public about Ignatian spirituality. And I said that, I said, well, at the basis, it's conviction that everybody can have a personal relationship with God. And I remember the audience back then, that would have been about 1980.
Oh, yeah.
People were stunned. They were like, this is revolutionary. And I just took it for granted. But I think it is. It's very profound when people are really invited to say, you're not, a collection of random molecules adrift in the universe. There is love that is the origin and our destiny. And you can have a personal connection with that and with a guiding spirit in your life. And that really is at the heart of it. So part of it then, I think a key to Ignatian spirituality is he developed for the first time a real systematic approach to spiritual discernment, he called it. Now that word had been around in the Christian tradition, since the New Testament times, but he was the first person that really began to articulate that in some depth and rigor. How do you, as a person, then really discern, listen, figure out how that the Creator is moving within you, and what's authentic and what's a false lead? And really, some would say, though he was very much a late medieval person, in another way, he's the first modern because he's the first modern period psychological writer. You know,
Right.
he's really looking at the interior of the human being and how do we function and how do we really tell what's in our best interest in for authentic human development and flourishing, and what are blind paths
Right.
that lead us down. So that's one aspect of it. And the other, I would say, is the other document that he left us is the Constitutions, kind of the rule book of the Jesuit order.
Oh, okay.
But it's not just a rule book.
Right.
It's really a book of spirituality that takes the vision of the spiritual exercises and puts it into how do we live a way of life as a community of people, a corporate body, a corporate person that's filled with that Spirit of God,
Right.
and find our way as a group of people that are dedicated to serving others. So, back to the spiritual exercise for a minute. So the basic dynamic of this experiences that you're invited into it begins first with a kind of confrontation with yourself and the disorder in ourselves and the world. And then it's ideally a radical experience of freedom. I think that's a key word, that each person's free and you get freed of the conditioning, to use our modern language, the conditioning of your past. I really think every human being grows up in a culture, and no culture is perfect. So we all grow up deformed, right, by our upbringing and our cultural experience. So we all have to go through a spiritual process of getting freed from the distortions of our own culture and upbringing. And then in that freedom, then Ignatius sets forth, now see, can you follow Jesus? Can you model your life on him? And so then he takes all that and says, okay, can a bunch of us do that together? And give ourselves completely to serving God's purposes in the world, serving the needs of people. Right. So a big phrase for St. Ignatius was ayudar las almas, to help souls. And I think that's really a key characteristic of the Jesuits, because talking with other clergy people, priests, religious, often their starting point is, how do we bring the gospel to people? How do we bring Christianity to people? And in a sense, there's an agenda there. Whereas Ignatius' starting point was, how can we help people? It's a different focus, yes, and it will be very helpful for them to know the gospel and to know the light of Christ. But when you're not starting with an agenda, except how can we serve? How can we help?
I like that, and
Yeah.
I like that idea of from disorder to order. I think is helpful language for a lot of people. Like you can visualize that.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And from being conditioned to being really free spiritually,
right,
like, oh, I don't have to do this thing that I was growing up thinking I had to do.
Right. Oh, that's awesome. But that gives me so many more questions. But,
okay.
So thinking about this idea of Ignatian spirituality, how has that inform or influence your philosophy of church ministry? Like I said, you pastored several different churches, mm-hmm. And so I guess going into one, were they all Jesuit churches?
Oh no.
Right. Okay. So I guess this is a Jesuit church here.
Yes. Right.
So they kind of already had that foundation, but especially if you're going into a church that wasn't specifically Jesuit, how did that form your philosophy of church ministry and how you shaped it?
Well, I think, just picking up the notes of what I was just talking about, I think a key approach is inviting, everything you do or say, you're inviting people into that depth of their personal spiritual life, the depth of their own relationship with the Creator, and ultimately with Christ. So that's a foundation, and that also comes from the exercises. One of the meditations Ignatius has, where he says, how does Christ work and how does the enemy work in our lives? And he does it through like symbols and imagery. But one of the things he says is that Christ invites the enemy, ensnares, and entraps people, seduces them. So it's a life of invitation, and that also then implies the freedom of the other, that you're ministering to people. The foundation of that ministry is respect for their freedom and their integrity. So I think that really characterizes it. Again, it's not so much that you're ministering, well, I have an agenda, something I want to give to you, but it's more like inviting what I believe is in you to come out, and that's going to be unique to each person and their gifts. So I think that is part of it. And then I think part of that orientation to helping souls, as Ignatius said, helping other people, has led, at least in the contemporary area, what we would call to a social justice commitment. Right. So we're responding to the real needs of people. Well, then that means responding to the needs of the poor and the inequities in the world and the oppression that's there. And so I think, at least in our contemporary period, we've brought a real focus on social justice to ministry. And even after that Second Vatican Council, of course, each religious order had a big gathering to sort of reform itself.
Right.
And out of that, we coined this phrase, faith and justice, that the two have to go together. Now, we refined that a little later to bring more elements into that, but it's basically a sense that you can't really pursue the development of faith and a spiritual life in people without attending to justice at the same time. And then we added to that later, nor can you do that without a real attention to the human culture of the people and the situation you're in, and without attention to religious traditions that might already be there. So you've got four elements of religion, culture, faith, and social justice that all have to be, ingredients in the soup and cooking at the same time, or it's not going to come out right. So I think that really characterizes a lot of what Jesuits do and say, even though, for our early centuries, we were almost so much invested in schools, still those schools have these ingredients in them now.
So you've been ordained since 1980.
Yes.
So that's over 40 years now that you've been.
Oh my gosh, am I that old?
Is that right? I think so. That's right.
Yeah.
If I'm doing my math right. So
45 years.
45 years. Wow. You say has been the greatest fulfillment in these last 40 plus years, or one of the greatest fulfillments? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot to choose from, but.
Yeah. My answer to that would be, come back in about 30 years when I'm dead and ask me that, because I won't know until then. But, I always have a hard time with, what's your favorite this or your greatest that. Yeah. But I would say, and it's going to follow right on what we've already been talking about, that my greatest fulfillment is when I'm a part of the growth and spiritual transformation in individual lives and in the life of a community. So when I see people growing, coming alive, experiencing change that is positive for them, as individuals or as a community, that's when I feel the best and feel the greatest about what's happening. And I phrase that very carefully, because I think one of the things that is a paradox of satisfaction in this life of ministry, right, is that I'm a part of it, I would say. Right. And what I mean by that is it's very clear when you are a part of something like that, it's not you. There's some higher power, some higher uh, spirit that's at work that is allowing this growth and this development and this liberation of people to happen. And so it's the joy of sitting back and saying, wow, look at that. Look what is unfolding here. It's beyond you. Yet at the same time, there's that paradox that it is you. It's coming through you, and it's coming through the other people that are involved. I would just put it as simply saying, look, if we didn't show up and say, yes, we're open, it wouldn't happen. Right. So there's that wonderful paradox that I would say that God has so arranged the human world that God depends on human cooperation. And that's what's so rewarding, I think, is to see that our feeble, stumbling, flawed human efforts are the channel through which wonderful things can happen in people's lives, and healing takes place and liberation takes place. So, yeah.
You mentioned community, which I was surprised to learn that Jesuits live in community.
Oh. Okay.
So I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So could you just maybe talk about that? Like what, because that's a part of the characteristic, right?
Yes, sure. Yeah, and that's what I said, why the constitutions are important in our history. It's not just a spiritual exercise, it's personal transformation, but how do you live and work together
right.
as a group? So, yeah, so that was, again, I think you can look at our history and see, so Ignatius was, he grew up in an era where education was not common for everybody, but he realized as he felt his calling to be really effective that he needed to go back to school, which he did as an adult. And when he was at university, that's when some other students were attracted to him, and he gathered a little group of followers, and they decided that they would well, first of all, their plan was to go to the Holy Land and die there as martyrs. And that didn't work out because there was some war going on and there were no ships going to the Holy Land. So they were stuck in Venice, the port city. And they said, well, that didn't work. So let's put ourselves at the service of the Pope. We'll go to the Pope and say, here we are. What do you want us to do? And the thought was that they might each be sent to a different place and never see each other again. So they entered into that Ignatian word, a discernment together to say, do we want to be split up or do we want to form some kind of a group? So I think that was right there in our history, is that there was a real discernment that, yes, working together, it accomplishes more than us just working individually. And so, ever since then, there's been Jesuits living together. Now, oftentimes, in those early days, the missions would be 2 or 3 people. It wasn't like 20 like we have now in a community. But there was that sense that I'm not just doing my own thing. Right. I'm part of a group that is collectively has certain goals and efforts that it's accomplishing, and I will put my life at the service of that. So I would say for us, though, say compared to monks that live in a monastery where the life together is the principal thing that binds them, for us, it's the sense of mission and service, and the outward movement that we're doing is what binds us, and the community is a kind of a means to that, or a part of that. That the main emphasis isn't on how we. Although it's interesting, in recent times we have said more like, how we live together is itself a way of saying something in the world, and if we aren't really living together in a way that is attractive to people, that's we're not getting the message across there. So I'd say we're maybe in like the heyday of early 20th century, 1950s, we were probably too much the emphasis on our work, what we're doing, and not much on how we're living together. So I think we're a little more conscious of that now. But, I think that's a big part of the refinement of character that goes on in the course of a lifetime. You know that from a marriage. I mean, you're right up against it with another human being, and you have to learn acceptance, radical acceptance of the other. You have to learn, how to get along with their faults and failings. And guess what? You become very aware of your own in the process. And so there's that mutual growth that goes on there of in how do you really love someone else and how do you relate to same thing happens in community in a different scale, but I've always lived my whole life with at least, I think the smallest community I was ever in was 6 people.
Wow.
But more typically 10 to 20 or more, and there's that constant rubbing against the rough edges of each other and the humanity of each other and learning how do we really love one another, and how do we really come to a place where we are able to discern together how the Spirit is working in us. I think another thing that is very distinctive of the Jesuits is with this emphasis on the personal development and the personal encounter with God and the Spirit. Ignatius made the people that are in authority in the Jesuits, we call them superiors or a provincial superior over a region. Their number one obligation in authority is to spend personal time with each person in their care and really get to know the person and get to know what's going on in their interior life, so that all of our governance comes out of it and is based on profound personal knowledge of what's going on. That's not the case in a lot of church institutions where decisions are based on other factors, not on. I this would say, no, it's got to begin with profound knowledge of how is God at work in that person.
Right. That makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So that's a big part of our community life, is that importance of knowing each other's spiritual life.
I imagine there's also been a lot of challenges and maybe some disappointments along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like a challenge that you could share that you've had to work through at some point?
Yeah, that one was an easy one to answer, I think. And it's a big one. It is that I came of age and entered the seminary and the Jesuit order in the late 60s and 70s. That was the formative period. And those who are listening who are old enough to remember that, it was an era of a lot of idealism, and institutions were undergoing profound change. It was a lot of hope for change in the future and leaving, crusty things from the past behind. Well, it didn't work out that way. I would say beginning in the 80s, we start to see the retrenchment and the, really regressive forces in the church come to the fore. So the big challenge for me has been, having my early years so idealistic and envisioning all this change and cultural development that would happen in the church, and then seeing so much resistance and so much backwards. And that's been hard. I never imagined that I would spend the last couple decades of my life sometimes feeling like a foreigner in my own church, because so many people are stuck in the past, clinging to the past. A Jesuit that I know uses a phrase that I think is very good. He talks about toxic nostalgia.
Oh, yeah.
Toxic nostalgia that cling to the past that really is deleterious and harmful to the present moment.
Right.
So now, to give it its due, we're living through an era of profound cultural change and secularization, and a mass movement, at least in Western culture, away from religion and Christianity. So I think a lot of people in the church, well-intentioned, their response to that is, oh, this is awful. We better get back to when it was working. Let's go back to the 1950s because that's when, the pews were full and we were all united and everything was great. And I just don't buy that. I mean, it's well-intentioned, but I do not think that you can go back, that that's ever really a healthy move. We've got to go forward. We've got to emerge. We've got to move into the challenges that are there. We got to move into the secularization and say, how do Ignatius would ask the question, how do you find God in all things? So how do we go into a secularized culture? How do we go into a changing culture and find God in that?
Right.
And adapt the message and the spirituality to the realities of a constantly evolving and changing human world.
Right.
So that's been the biggest challenge to me. Is when I was 30, I never imagined that in my 50s the church would be so stuck and wanting to hold on to the way things were.
Right.
And of course you can see as the way I respond to your questions, I think our history and our tradition is a very important resource for us. And we draw on that. And the great saints of the past are our guide in a lot of ways. So I'm not saying don't pay attention to the past. It's important. But I would say don't get stuck there.
Right.
How do you take that tradition, a living tradition, and go forward?
Yeah.
The season, as you're talking about the season that we're in, and this very kind of upside down, turbulent season, at least for our country. Maybe as we close, some words of encouragement for people who are really wrestling with that.
Yeah. It's a tough time. The first thing that comes to my mind on that, because it's fresh in my mind, is the second scripture reading from the liturgy last Sunday, which was one where St. Paul says, our citizenship is not here. Our citizenship is above. It's in the kingdom of God. And I think that's very helpful at a time like this to realize there's a bigger picture. That isn't an invitation. It could sound like an invitation to escapism.
Right.
Like this world doesn't matter. Let's concentrate on heaven. But it isn't that at all. But it is saying, don't forget the bigger picture.
Right.
Don't forget that there is a God who is the creator of all this, and in ways that we can't understand. We see this now. We have this awareness of the whole evolution of the whole cosmos and the universe and the human race and what that's all beyond us to really. So you got to step back and keep the bigger picture. So that's one thing. And to put it more concretely, there's a historical marker right across the street here, outside our window, that Frederick Douglass was here for a meeting. And I saw a quote from him the other day that I think is great for this. I won't get the words exactly right, but he was living through the worst, a black man living through the worst of slavery in this country and the Civil War. So if anybody,
Right.
was living through hard times and needed hope, and he said something like this, I do not despair of this country. The command of the Almighty, let there be light, has not lost its force. Or so maybe it was like it hasn't yet finished its work. So just that sense, there's a bigger picture here, and the intentions of God have not disappeared. Of course, human history is full of difficult periods along the way. So that's one. I think another encouragement, again, it's very recent for me. I just heard at our university last Friday night a guest lecture on the ethics of engaged Buddhism. Very interesting. And, especially because one interpretation of Buddhism, it's about disengagement from the world. But he said, no, there's another whole tradition in Buddhism of engagement, that all of the Buddhist principles are so that we can engage well with the world. And one of the things he talked about was patience, that we need patience in this time. And some of the students in the audience said, well, things are really urgent. We can't afford to sit back and wait. We've got to act. And he said, that's not what patience means in Buddhism. It doesn't mean sit back and do nothing. It means act, be engaged, but without anger and outrage. So, I think a spiritual life calls us to rise above our anger and our outrage, to be engaged, but not out of anger and not out of dismay. But when you rise above that, you're really saying, how can I have understanding and compassion for other people, even the ones that seem like my enemies, my opposition. So that's another encouragement, I think, is rise above our initial reactions and our emotional, like, what's happening?
Right.
Which
we all feel like.
Yeah. And, basically, I go back to the foundational things from our Ignatian spirituality. Stay connected to the Holy Spirit within you. Stay connected to the community, a community of faith and spirit, and stay connected to nature, to the natural world. I think those are three big things that anchor each of us in our lives: our own interior life and sense of connection with the holy, being part of a community that is sane and trying to be holy, and being connected with nature, which gets us out beyond ourselves and into that bigger picture of what is God doing in this creation. So stay rooted in those things, and by I would say that's our only way forward. We can't control other people, we can't control governments and what they're doing, politicians. We really only can control ourselves. So stay connected to the Spirit, stay connected to others who are engaged, stay connected to the natural world, and you'll have all you need. I think the words of a mystic from centuries ago, St. Teresa of Avila, says something like, how does it go? Quien a Dios tiene, nada le falta. Whoever has God lacks nothing. Solo Dios basta. God alone is